While it's gone through highs and lows over the years, the Western remains an alluring and surprisingly dexterous cornerstone of cinema, both American and abroad. It's always high noon somewhere in the world. 2021 was a good year for the Western, with Jane Campion's The Power of the Dog set to win big at the Academy Awards, including a not unlikely Best Picture win and an all but guaranteed Best Director win for Campion herself. Aside from Campion's most recent film, we also got James Samuel's The Harder They Fall, a critical darling in its own right, and Clint Eastwood's Cry Macho. The Western has the precarious reputation of being seen as an old-timey genre, one whose critical and financial viability is always in question. Yet I reckon that the Western has been doing better in the past decade than in the previous 20 years. Now may be as good a time as any to look back on Westerns, classic and modern, and how the genre has managed to survive despite having waxed and waned over time. The Western, in its most traditional form, is often associated with films produced during the span of Hollywood's so-called Golden Age, from the late 1930s to the early 1960s. It's often assumed that Westerns from the Golden Age are about greasy men fighting robbers and Native Americans on horseback, with an implicit endorsement of American imperialism. While this may be true in some cases, even Westerns made by the most conservative filmmakers of the period have the power to subvert expectations. John Ford's 1956 film, The Searchers, is a go-to pick for the greatest Western of all time. But it's also a film about how destructive and harmful racism toward Native American peoples is. Rio Bravo, from 1959, is a Howard Hawks film, arguably his best, in which a motley crew of men have to learn to control their worst habits and rely on each other's friendship to bring a single criminal to justice. A classic Western that spits in the face of toxic masculinity? It's more likely than you think. Speaking of subversions, it's hard to think of genre films, not just the Western, but any genre, released in the 1950s that played with gender dynamics, with an exception that comes to mind. Nicholas Ray was a controversial director in his day, primarily working on melodramas that questioned the then-current societal norms. One such melodrama was Johnny Guitar, starring Joan Crawford as a gunslinging woman who had the audacity to wear pants. While it's important to keep in mind that movies like Rio Bravo and Johnny Guitar were by no means the average Western being put out at the time, these big studio efforts are indicative of a genre that clearly served as a playground for creative filmmakers, in which, much like horror and science fiction, tropes and commonly held beliefs could be critiqued safely under a cloak of genre trappings. Perhaps the first notable filmmaker on the international stage to take inspiration from the Western was Akira Kurosawa, arguably the finest director to ever come out of Japan. Kurosawa had already copped some well-worn Western tropes for Seven Samurai in 1954. The film itself is hardly a Western, though it's telling that it would be remade as The Magnificent Seven. But he would break into the genre properly with Yojimbo in 1961. Yojimbo is on some level a case of Kurosawa boiling the part, making a deliberately lightweight action romp with Toshiro Mifune as the gruff anti-hero. Yet Kurosawa was too much of a genius to make a standard potboiler. The film is a near masterpiece about a lone samurai taking on a town of criminals, including a gun-wielding lead villain. The premise of Yojimbo is simple but effective. It wouldn't take long for some other movie to follow in its footsteps. Cut to 1964, we have Italian director Sergio Leone, now famous for The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, in charge of an unauthorized remake, to the point of there being a legal battle, with A Fistful of Dollars. A Fistful of Dollars was quite evidently a low-budget affair, but that didn't stop it from launching the career of Clint Eastwood as a leading man, not to mention the wave of Italian westerns, known as spaghetti westerns, in its wake. During the 1960s and 1970s, some of the finest westerns would not come from the United States, but Italy and elsewhere. When you think of a now classic western, Star Wars probably won't come to mind. Although, of course, Star Wars is nothing short of a monumental event in film history. When Star Wars was released in 1977, it followed on the heels of a wave of westerns that were more violent and downbeat than their classic Hollywood predecessors. Yet, despite being fairly gritty, especially when compared to future entries in the franchise, Star Wars contributed most to the genre by taking certain Western tropes and transplanting them to a galaxy far, far away. The first half of the movie, in which the action is set on the desert planet of Tatooine, takes as much inspiration from the likes of John Ford and Sergio Leone as anything else. Indeed, Star Wars, partly by its virtue of its immense popularity, would give a rise to a fruitful subgenre of the Western, the space Western. Being a marriage between the Western and science fiction, the space Western is at liberty to indulge in both sci-fi and Western iconography, sometimes to stirring effect. Think of cowboys with ray guns or high-tech action in a desert landscape. The space Western recently saw huge exposure with the hit series The Mandalorian, not to mention the short-lived but highly respected series Firefly.
We're not thieves, but we are thieves. The point is, we're not taking what's his.
Back in 2002. Rather inexplicably, there was also a brief meteor shower of space Western anime that premiered in the 1990s. Most famously Cowboy Bebop, but also Trigun and Outlaw Star. The turn of the millennium undoubtedly saw a downturn in Western activity, with the number of notable releases being drearily low. Even Clint Eastwood, a veteran and champion of the genre for decades, did not act in or direct any Western in the 2000s. The game would change drastically in 2007, however, with the release of no fewer than 4 notable Westerns, ranging from self-aware schlock to major awards contenders. To start, we have 3:10 to Yuma, starring Christian Bale and Russell Crowe. A remake of the 1957 film of the same name. Then we have The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford, starring Brad Pitt, which garnered 2 Oscar nominations, including a nod for legendary cinematographer Roger Deakins. On the more eccentric side of things, we have a release in Japan with Takashi Miike's Sukiyaki Western Django, a knowingly goofy genre spoof that features a cameo by Quentin Tarantino of all people. The most important Western to come from 2007, and by extension, one of the most critically acclaimed movies of the 2000s, has to be No Country for Old Men.
Well done. Don't put it in your pocket, sir. Don't put it in your pocket, it's your lucky quarter.
Written and directed by the Coen brothers, and faithfully adapted from Cormac McCarthy's novel, No Country for Old Men is a pitch-black Western set in Texas circa 1980. Anton Chigurh, played to perfection by Javier Bardem, has to be one of the creepiest villains in film history. A completely remorseless killer with a bizarre moral code who haunts the wastelands like an evil spirit. The film was a huge comeback moment for the Coen brothers, who had just put out some questionable movies like Intolerable Cruelty and The Lady Killers. But No Country for Old Men would also restore some dignity in the Western, an elevation whose ripple effects we would witness in the following decade. This is the part where I focus on 2 or 3 movies that represent a certain era of filmmaking, and truth be told, there are too many Westerns to consider in the 2010s. Most apparently, we have award winners like Alejandro González Iñárritu's The Revenant in 2015.
I'm talking to you.
And the animated feature Ranco in 2011. Winner of the Best Animated Feature Oscar, a rare honor for a non-Disney film. And 2 Westerns from Quentin Tarantino, with Django Unchained and The Hateful Eight in 2012 and 15, respectively.
She's wanted dead or alive for murder. When that sun comes out, I'm taking this woman to hang. Is there anybody here committed to stopping me from doing that?
The Coen brothers returned to the Western with The Ballad of Buster Scruggs in 2018, with the film garnering 3 Oscar nominations in the process. We also have critically acclaimed Westerns from abroad, with Thebe, Jordan's first Best International Feature nomination in 2014, and Brazil's Bacurau in 2019. Simply too many to count. If anything, the Western seems to have gone through a renaissance in the 2010s. A renaissance that is still going strong, if The Power of the Dog being a critical and awards powerhouse is to remind us of anything. The Western has been a part of cinema pretty much since the beginning, since the Great Train Robbery blew people's minds way back in 1903, and it shows no signs of going away for too long.